Okay, so this is where we left off last time, where we were looking at the four different definitions of morality. Now, remember that these four are a cumulative case, okay? So this is going to be, these four together are going to form a good definition of morality, not one of them by themselves. And we'll see that because they have weaknesses for each one. So last time we went over the first two, which is a judgment is moral only if it's accepted as a supremely authoritative overriding guide to conduct. So the keywords here are the overriding guide. If it's going to be a moral statement in the ballpark of being moral, then it needs to be something that can override other things like desires. Okay. If it's not, if it's just like one in a field of many things that help you determine how to make a decision or what you want, then that's not moral. That's just falls into a different category of desire or impulse or something like that. But morality seems to imply that there's this overriding guide. Okay. Another one is that a judgment is moral only if it's a prescriptive imperative, not a factual description. Okay. So something, if I just told you what it looked like outside, it's sunny outside right now, that doesn't recommend any action to you explicitly. Now, it could imply, based on the context of what we're talking about, so let's go outside, or so it might be hot, or something like that, but I didn't actually say that, right? I just described what was going on. So if you're just describing something about morality, okay, murder makes people sad, okay, that's a description of something, but it doesn't necessarily explicitly recommend action based on that fact. Okay, that would be a moral statement. If you gave a description and then gave a recommendation, that's more in the category of morality. Now, this one, we're going to talk about fact value here in a minute, but this one does bring up an important point, that moral judgments do need to prescribe rather than just describe. They need to have some sort of obligation tied to them, some sort of action tied to them. Something needs to happen because the statement was made. But then it also has a flaw in the fact that it's not really sufficient. Remember, necessary and sufficient? It's not sufficient for a definition of morality because there are other oughts, there are other obligations rather than morality. For example, rational oughts. Okay, rational obligations or aesthetic obligations. They're not just moral obligations. Okay, so we couldn't say that anything that recommends action is moral because it could be rational or it could be aesthetic. So in this sense, this definition is really helpful, but it's not sufficient. So we got two down, so let's go to the third one. A judgment is moral only if it is, here's a good word for you, universalizable. That is, if it applies equally to all relevantly similar situations. So if we're going to call a judgment or a statement moral, then that means that it needs to be, specific enough to recommend action, like we saw in the last one, but general enough to recommend action in all situations that are similar, okay? At least meaningfully similar in the same ways. So this could be, there may be disagreement about where to draw the line between what's similar and what's not, but if you're going to have a rule, if you're going to have a law, if you're going to have a statement, and you're going to call it a moral statement in the ballpark of morality, then that means that it needs to be general enough to be able to be applied in similar situations. It can't be specific where it's just for this time in this specific context with these specific people. It's got to be a little more general than that. This does bring up an important point, that moral judgments aren't just arbitrary, okay? That it does need to apply to situations where it applies to, and then it doesn't apply to other situations. So it can't just be arbitrary. If it's going to apply to one, it's got to apply to all, okay? But there needs to be, sometimes it's difficult to discern the difference between situations that are similar and situations that are not. One person might think, oh yeah, this is exactly the same situation I was in the other day, so let's go about it the same way. But another person might not see it that way. There needs to be some sort of relevant distinctions between similar situations in order to judge them differently, okay? Okay, the fourth definition of morality is that a judgment is moral only if it makes reference to proper human flourishing human dignity, the welfare of others, the prevention of harm, and the provision of benefit. Now, this might be closer to what you might think of as morality. That might be a little more academic-y than you're used to, but a judgment is moral only if it makes reference to proper human flourishing, human dignity, the welfare of others, prevention of harm, and provision of benefit. So a lot, if not most, if not all, moral codes that we live by or are familiar with have some sort of reference to these areas. Like at their core, this is what they're about. And if they're not about these things, then we tend to not think that they're worth our time, or maybe they're even, if they're against these things, then we think they're bad. Now sometimes that's hard to discern, but if we think about it at its core, it'll be if we get down to the core of the moral statement, what it's really getting at, what it's really trying to accomplish, then it's a little easier to determine whether or not it's a moral or immoral statement. Okay, a good point about this is that the point of morality anyway is to preserve human life and all that that entails. I mean, animals don't have moral codes. They don't. They have habits, they have characteristics, they have maybe even like rules, so to speak, about how they relate to each other, but they don't have morals in the same sense that we have morals. Okay, so the point of morality is to preserve not just life, but human life and all that it entails. Okay, which is an important point because this it does say that the point of morality is to preserve human life, but we also see that all that that entails has a lot to do with things that aren't human life. Like, for example, animals, right? Our treatment of animals, and we think we have definite moral ideas about how we treat animals. The environment, okay? This might be a little more of a controversial topic, but as far as its morality goes, but we can all see that there are different opinions about the morality of dealing with the environment. So if you treat the environment poorly, then we might almost, especially if like a big corporation does, then we might almost think of that as on the edge of an immoral action. Okay, but this definition doesn't address that. It only addresses humans, which is kind of interesting, good and needed, but ultimately inadequate because it doesn't address other things that we do assess moral or assign moral value to, like our treatment of animals and our treatment of the environment. So these four taken together are a really good definition of morality, taken together. So it needs to be about human flourishing. It needs to be morality needs to be relevantly applicable in different situations. So it needs to apply here and here and here if they're similar. Okay. It needs to be prescriptive, not just descriptive. It needs to tell you what to do. And it needs to be an overriding guide when it tells you what to do. So that's a pretty good, pretty thorough definition of morality. Now, something else we need to talk about when we're talking about morality, we're just going to kind of get some concepts straight before we dive into the theories, is something called a fact-value debate. I told you we'd talk about this, but the fact-value debate looks complicated, but it's actually really easy. But it is probably the number one area of disagreement when people disagree about moral values or when they disagree about actions. I would say 99% of the time, this is how they're disagreeing. And the funny thing is they don't have to disagree once they realize where the conflict really lies, okay? So when we talk about a fact, we're talking about something that is, okay, just a description of something, okay? This is a statement about morality. But a value implies an ought, like a compulsion or an obligation towards something, okay, or away from something. That's a prescriptive statement, and it is a statement of morality. As we discovered in our definitions, that something that prescribes something to you is going to be a moral statement, a statement of morality. Okay, now understand that these two things are different. Okay, just like we talked about description and prescription as being different, that's the same thing we've got here. Fact and value are different things. So this helps with discerning the source of the moral disagreement. Here's some examples. When people talk about abortion, which is a hot topic and very, sharply divided topic, especially in this country, when people talk about abortion, people who are pro-life, what do they say, right? What do they say when they are arguing against pro-choice people, when they're arguing for pro-life, when they're arguing against pro-choice, arguing against abortion, what do they say? They say things like, right, and sometimes they're a little bit inflammatory, but they say things like, abortion is wrong because it's killing a human, and killing humans is wrong. Why, they even get all up in arms, right? Why don't you see that? Like, really, are you okay with killing humans? Okay. Well, what's the only thing that the pro-choice proponent has to say? That's not a human, right? I fully agree. This is where we agree on the value. Okay, the value is it's wrong to kill humans, right? But we disagree on the fact of whether or not that fetus is a human person. Okay, that's where the conflict really lies. Now, of course, the pro-choice person is concerned about murdering humans. Of course, they're not okay with that. This doesn't have any bearing on this for them, because to them, that's not, they don't think there's enough evidence to say that that's a human person, right? So you see where the conflict is. It's not in the value. They both value the same thing. So when people get all inflammatory and say things like, you're murderers, you don't care about life, that's simply not true. They're confusing the value there. They both have the same value, right? But they disagree on is the facts about the issue. Okay, same thing that happens here with Eskimos and their treatment of elders. So we've talked about this before in this class, right? About how Eskimos, back when they were a lot more nomadic, when the elders became elderly, they would take them out onto the ice pack and just leave them, okay? The reason why they did this is because they have a really deep, deep respect for their elders. That sounds strange to us because that sounds like the opposite of what we would do if we were going to show respect for our elders. But the fact is that, when you think about the idea that respect means, well, now these elders wouldn't be seen as feeble and frail. They wouldn't have the indignity of slowing down the tribe, right? They wouldn't hinder anybody hunting or moving the tribe, since they're real nomadic, right? And the legacy of and the memory of that person would remain in the minds of the people that they left behind as strong and vibrant, right? That seems to be a really respectful thing to do. And so the elders knew this. They knew this was what would happen to them when they got older, right? And so this is what would happen: is they would take them out onto the ice pack and leave them for a quiet, dignified death away from everybody else. Now we see that as horrific, but understand that we both cultures respect our elders. We just have very different ways of showing it. So we agree on the value of respecting elders, but we disagree on the facts of how to get that done. Okay. One more example: Spartans and stealing. So in ancient Sparta, this was a warrior culture, which is an understatement of the year. These people were amazing. Okay. But they were very convinced that stealing was, the absconding with someone else's property, okay, and making it your own, was a virtue, not a vice. And stealing like we think of stealing, right? Going and finding something that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to somebody else, and taking it for your own without paying for it or them gifting it to you or anything like that, okay? So here we have an idea where our culture and Spartan culture agree on the fact, right? The fact about stealing. Okay, we know what stealing is. It's taking something that doesn't belong to you. However, we disagree on the value. We do not value stealing, but Spartans do value stealing. Okay, so do you see the difference between facts and values? And when people disagree about moral things, it's often because they either disagree about the facts or they disagree about the values. It's often not both, though. Okay, but when they fight is when they think they disagree on the value, but they really don't. They just disagree on the fact. So to get around moral disagreements, it's usually helpful to understand, are we on the same page with value here? Because if I know that you respect your elders and you know that I respect my elders, then maybe we can talk about the differences we have in showing that, right? But at least we have some common ground there, and that's a really good way to resolve moral disagreements. So fact value debate, really important. Okay, another thing we need to kind of get straight is when we start to think morally, and I'm just going to go through this quickly. We go through this a lot more in our ethics class, but just understand that when you're thinking through moral problems, we tend to go too quickly from our tend to come to conclusions too quickly, only based on our experience. So here's an example. Okay, so this is kind of the process we go through when we think morally. So let's say that we have an experience, namely, I feel angry when Mary lies to me. Okay, that's my experience. I've just been lied to by Mary. I feel angry when I discover that she's lied. My interpretation of that experience is that what Mary did to me was wrong. Now, look, all I'm doing is going from my experience to my interpretation. Okay, I'm not bringing in anything else. I'm only relying on my experience, which in this case is an emotional reaction, in order to interpret the morality of the situation. Okay, now most people stop there, but the next stage is even more interesting. If I get to analysis, now I can talk about things like, is lying always wrong? Was Mary's lie justified in this case? Is there a situation where this might have been called for? This might have been actually the best thing to do, right? So notice that you go through this process when you think through moral experiences, moral claims, moral ideas that you might have, convictions that you might have. Here's another example. So my experience is that the average annual income of men is higher than women. And here we're talking about in the United States, right? And usually white people is what we're talking about here. So the average income of men is higher than women's. So my interpretation of that experience could be that men are more competent than women, right? I mean, I look at that and I'm like, well, clearly men must be more competent. The woman and the man are doing the same job. The man's getting paid more. Men are more competent than women. But if I go forward further into the analysis category, now I'm asking myself, are those facts really correct? Like, are they really doing the same job? Did the woman really get paid less than the man? And if that's true, is it just to pay less based on gender? Now, most of us would respond instantly no, but let's think about it. I mean, why do we say that? There's something behind that. There's something behind why we act so strongly about that. So let's analyze that and let's bring in some other information, not just from my experience. So you see what happens when we think morally just from our experience. We often don't get to the analysis portion. We often stop right there, right? We stop right there because of things like resistance, things like ignorance, things like denial, anger, cliches, right? Or the catch-all phrase, I'm just struggling with that. I'm just struggling with that. We don't, we give ourselves an out, right? And just remain in this sort of struggling mode for forever, because that means we don't have to come to any conclusions. We don't have to take a stand on anything, right? But we stop often at, I feel angry when Mary lies to me. What Mary did to me was wrong. And we just stop there. And then it ends up creating this sort of like overarching rule that all the time it's wrong at any point for any lie at any, and it becomes this sort of, an overriding guide, but in a bad way, right? Where we never consider exactly why it's wrong, what the justification for that statement is. It's only based on our experience. We never get to the analysis part. Okay. So don't do that. Don't stop there. Get all the way to the analysis part and figure out what it is that you actually think about things that you're experiencing, that you come to moral conclusions on. Okay, last thing that we need to kind of get straight is the role of the conscience when we're thinking morally. Okay, when we're thinking, anytime we start thinking about moral decisions or becoming a good person or anything like that, then this idea of a conscience always comes up. Like, where do those feelings come from? Where do those thoughts or conclusions come from? Okay, and a lot of people will say that it comes from the conscience. The problem is we really don't have any idea what the conscience is, and depending on your worldview, then you're going to have some different answers. So here are some options, right? Usually in religious worldviews, it's sometimes referred to as some sort of guiding light or an energy, right, that can somehow guide, okay? For Jung, who's a psychologist, and for some other Eastern religions, it's called the basic law of consciousness. So in other words, if you're conscious, then you have a conscience. me say that 10 times fast. If you're conscious, then you have a conscience, okay? It's a law of consciousness. So if you're a conscious being, then you have, awake, alert, and oriented, okay? Then you have a conscience in there as part of that consciousness. Okay. Plato thought it was an actual activity of the soul. Okay. He thought it was a component of the soul that directs us toward the good. So in Plato's view, the conscience could never really direct you towards the bad. That was always, and because he was Plato and because it was way back then, it was usually like your fleshly desires that would guide you toward the bad, but your soul, which was immaterial, would guide you towards the good. And then Kant, remember him, Immanuel Kant, he thought it was something called the goodwill, which kind of implies, and I think Kant would agree, that it could be squelched, or it could be fed and nurtured. Okay, so we've known people with a lot of goodwill or people with very little goodwill, right? So people with a lot of goodwill have had that sort of fostered that feeling and practiced that a lot until they're very good at it, and that's part of the way they live their life. People with no goodwill or people with ill will, right, are Scrooges. Okay, they're people who don't see the good in life and who are determined not to share it with other people, and right, they're people that are closed off and isolated. So Kant thought that the conscience was the goodwill, and you could choose to sort of foster that and train it even further into the good, or you could choose to kind of squelch it and then it would end up leading you astray. In any case, though, even though we don't know exactly what it is, in any case, everyone seems to have one, right? Even if it eventually becomes weak, ineffective, maybe you don't hear it anymore at all, right? It doesn't give you those twinges, those pricks, right? But there's something there, whether it's just a line of reasoning or whether it's an actual thing. There's something there that seems to motivate us, that seems to demand things of us. It demands that we do things or demands that we stop doing things, right? It's very irritating sometimes. There are probably three, whatever it is, again, there are three contributing forces to this. One is hereditary or biological factors. Okay, so who your parents are, who your family is, and how you were raised definitely have a pretty big hand in shaping your conscience. I mean, they have a hand in shaping how you see the world anyway. So that's definitely going to have a hand in shaping what you know of as good and bad, and then that's going to affect how your conscience directs you, right, towards the good or towards the bad. Then there's also going to be closely tied to that is learning or environmental factors, right? So how you're taught. This is why school and training kids early is so important, and the experiences that kids have, right, the biological factors and the environmental factors are huge for determining, trying to build a person with good character, with a conscience that directs them towards really good things instead of towards bad things, or instead of just being silent, right? At any rate, it also is you can also contribute towards the conscience through something called conscious moral reformation. Okay, this is done by autonomous moral reasoning. Okay, autonomous, right? Self-contained, self-owned. Okay, autonomous moral reasoning. So you deciding to think for yourself about morality, to decide what you think about things with good justification, that is, and then adopting that into your worldview as this is how I'm going to live my life. That's autonomous moral reasoning. Okay. Now, yes, our decisions even about that are going to be tainted a little bit, sometimes in a bad way, sometimes in a good way, by our biology, by our environment. But the fact remains that you can be an autonomous moral agent. You can think through things and decide things despite any bias that you might have, because you know how to justify things. And then habituation. Aristotle was a really big proponent of this. He thought, we'll talk about his idea of virtues here after a while, but he thought that habituation was the key to producing a good life and a good character. So he thought that you couldn't, even if you knew the right thing, you couldn't actually produce a good life even in yourself unless you practiced it over and over and over again until it became a habit. That was his his thought. So it's part of the reason why he started developing a system of ethics, because he thought if you practiced it and practiced it and practiced it, that's only going to get better. That's only going to create better pathways for you to be able to think through, different moral situations that might be thrown at you. So conscience, it does have a really big role in our thinking about morality. So it's good to know a little bit about what contributes to it and what it might be. Okay, we're getting into the theories now. Now remember, in the field of ethics, right, there's theoretical ethics, okay, and then there's normative ethics. And under normative ethics, there's cognitive theories and non-cognitive theories, okay? We're dwelling in the cognitive theories, okay? Cognitive theories and the cognitive theories, right, cognitive, come in two different styles. They either come in relativist theories or universalist theories. Okay, we're going to discuss the 5 relativist theories first. Now, they're all going to have common ground with relativism, so you kind of have that to your favor because you know a little bit of what to expect, but that comes in some different flavors. Okay, so here are the 5 theories: descriptive relativism, normative relativism, which is kind of an oxymoron, conceptual relativism, ethical skepticism, and combinatorial relativism. Okay, let's talk about descriptive relativism first. What I'm going to do is give you the main claim of the theory, and then I'm going to give you some pros and cons, okay? So the main thing about descriptive relativism is a little weird because remember one of our rules for our, one of our definitions of morality was that it had to prescribe, not just describe, right? Well, this is called descriptive relativism. So already there's a little bit of a flag there. This is the one that's argued by people in fields like anthropology, sociology, and history. Okay, for good reason, because they know a lot about and they observe a lot about different cultures. But it is just descriptive; it is not prescriptive. Okay, so their main thesis for descriptive relativism is that societies do have differing views on basic ethical judgments. Societies have different views on basic ethical judgments. That's all. Okay? Remember, it's just descriptive. It's kind of like saying, it's sunny outside. And that's all. It doesn't recommend anything for you to do. It doesn't come to any conclusions based off of that. What they mean by that is that all the facts are agreed upon, but they disagree as to the value. Okay, so it's kind of like us in Sparta, right? For the fact about what stealing is we know what that is, and all cultures know what that is. But what we disagree on is whether or not that's right or wrong. Okay, that's what they're claiming. Now, I think we would agree with that. We see that, right? But it doesn't really give us anything to do with it, with the theory. It just kind of gives us a factoid, okay? So let's evaluate this theory a little bit. Like we've just said, it is descriptive and it's not prescriptive, which presents a huge problem that leaves out a whole definition of morality. And it also doesn't follow that just because there are differing views, it doesn't follow that there's no moral absolutes. Right? This is what's called a genetic fallacy, okay, or a naturalistic fallacy. So genetic fallacy says that you can't get an ought from an is, okay? So that means that if we have the is, okay, so the fact is societies and cultures have different views of morality, okay? A fallacy would say, so therefore there can't be any moral absolutes because everybody's different. But do you see how that's not necessarily true? It could be the case that everybody's got it wrong, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a moral code. It could, but what the fallacy claims is that that's what it means. It means that because cultures have different views, then that's what it means. We don't have there are no moral absolutes. See, because everyone is different, and that's not necessarily the case. It's a genetic fallacy. And then also, interestingly, when you really think about this, the fact that societies have differing views on basic ethical judgments of what is right and what is wrong, do they really? I mean, have you ever thought about that? We see a lot of differences, but we're talking moral differences, okay? We're not talking like cultural differences in the way you dress or the way you conduct your business, okay? We're talking about rightness and wrongness. I mean, I don't know of any culture that's still alive today that doesn't value human life. I mean, if you didn't value human life, you'd go extinct pretty quick, right? I mean, I don't know of any other culture that values cowardice in battle. There are some cultures that don't value battle, right? But for those that do, they don't, I mean, they don't value cowardice in battle. That seems weird and non-productive, okay? So, I mean, there are some basic moral things. I mean, killing people for no good reason, right? We don't we don't differ on that. We disagree. That's the value, right? We agree on the value. We disagree on the facts of what is a good reason to kill somebody and what's not a good reason to kill somebody. But we all agree that if you have no good reason, then that's not okay. So do you see how really when we think about it, we might not have as many differences as we think we do. So descriptive relativism is a pretty poor theory. For one thing, it's hardly a theory, it's just a description, right? And for another thing, it might not actually be accurate. So, interesting. Okay, the next one is called normative relativism. Okay, the thesis here is that everyone ought to act in accordance with your own society's code. Okay, and this is going to come in a couple different flavors, but this is the basic deal. Now, look, normative, right? Remember, means there's one overarching sort of one overarching standard that applies to everybody. What this wants to do is combine that standard with relativism and say that everyone with like your culture determines or your society determines what that overarching rule is, which is relativism. But as long as you're in that society, then everyone that's in that society has to abide by that overarching rule. That's the normative part, right? So it tries to kind of combine those two. So basically what this means is that what is right for one society could possibly be wrong for another society. Not just that we don't practice that here, we don't do that here. No, it goes beyond that. It's right over here and it's wrong over here. For example, adultery. A society could agree on the definition of what adultery is, but then disagree on its rightness or wrongness, right? One society says, yeah, that's good. Another society said, no, that's bad. Okay? It implies that really moral propositions are not true or false at all. There's nothing about moral statements that say, that something is like intrinsically bad or intrinsically good. They're just kind of there, like moral actions are just there, and it's up to the society to input the value. So you've got this action of adultery, right? And so you as a society can decide whether or not that action is right or wrong. And when it moves on to the next society, it's up for grabs. It's a neutral action, and the society determines the value. There are a couple of versions of this. Like I said, it comes in a couple different flavors: conventionalism or cultural relativism, and then subjectivism, which is the individual type, which we'll talk about here in a second. So let's evaluate this theory real quick. In my estimation, there are 5 really big problems with this. Okay, first of all, just housekeeping wise, it's really hard to define what a society is. It's a little easier kind of with a culture, but what exactly is a society? I mean, sometimes they're like political groups or like civic groups, right? Where you have like a society of, like, for example, my son is a part of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. I'm a part of like philosophical societies, right? So there's that. But then so we're talking about that, or what exactly is a society? And then we also see like maybe it's a family, maybe it's a church, maybe it's a school, maybe it's a city, right? We don't really know. And so because of that, it also seems like, because the boundaries are dubious about what a society is, it seems possible that we could be part of more than one society at a time, which is great. Yay, you have a lot of friends. But how do we determine which society calls the shots when they contradict their values? So like, let's say I'm part of a church and that says, X about a particular action. But then I'm also a part of a family society that says Y about that same particular action. I mean, one society says it's wrong, one society says it's right. I'm a member of both societies. How do I decide which society to follow? You know what I mean? So that's a problem. Number 3 is really powerful to me. So the third problem with this is that is called the reformer's dilemma. If you have, if you're only acting in accordance with your society's code, and if that's what makes you a moral person, then how is it that if that's true, then we could never have people that would reform a society from the inside. So, like, think of people like, Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks or Malala Yousaf or Mother Teresa or even Jesus or Gandhi or right. I mean, these people were a part of their society clearly, and then spoke out against their own society, saying this is not right. This is not good. This is not moral. What you're doing is not moral. But you see, if you're doing what your society has said is moral, then you're being moral. If you do something that it's against what your society does, then you are immoral. So how can there ever be any progress? How can there ever be any sense of getting better, right? With our morality. I mean, there can never be somebody that calls people out in their own society and says, y'all have it wrong. Like we as a society need to change. There can never be somebody like that, because that person would be considered an immoral person, and we wouldn't listen to them because they're going against the society's code rather than with the society's code. So there could never be a reformer. But clearly we've seen that there have been reformers, many of them. And so why is that? Why would we listen? If normative relativism is true, why would we listen to somebody who is not moral, who's not acting morally according to our own standard? It seems kind of silly. So the reformer's dilemma is a pretty powerful one to me. Number 4, some acts, it seems, are just wrong. It doesn't seem that there are any neutral actions, or at least there are some that are definitely not neutral. I mean, murder, for example, that's not up for grabs as far as whether or not somebody thinks it's right or thinks it's wrong. Let's consider this and we'll assign it a moral value. That doesn't seem to be up to us. It seems to have already been assigned, right? That murder is bad, and there's something about the taking of a life that way that seems wrong at its core. And it's not that anybody has just decided that it's wrong, it's that it is wrong, right? And so but that's not what normative relativism says. Normative relativism says that the society determines what the value of that action is. There's nothing about the action itself that gives it any rightness or wrongness. And then 5th, under normative relativism, it's really difficult to critique another society. Okay, really difficult. Why? Because as long as they're acting in accordance with their own society's code, then they're being moral. Okay, but we've seen, I mean, entire societies, if not subgroups within societies, that clearly what they're doing is wrong. Clearly their morals are off when they go about, raping and abusing women and children. I mean, that's wrong. But under normative relativism, we couldn't say they were wrong. As long as they were acting in accordance with their society's code, then we would have to say, not only is it like, well, agree to disagree, but we would have to say that they were right, that they were being moral. And you see how weird that gets. Okay, like I said, there's 2 different flavors to this one. One is called cultural relativism. Okay, and this one says that instead of your society determining, it's your culture determining. And by culture, we mean not only like your worldview, but like the place and time. Okay, so like United States, 200 years ago was very different place than it is now. So like what may have been okay back then is not okay now. So it might be even the same location, but different time. Okay, or it might be the same time but different place. But the point is that what's right or wrong depends on your place and time. Okay, there are some pros to this. I mean, different social contexts determine different moral guidelines. Like there may be some things that just don't work here and they do in Australia, right? I mean, I've visited several, I had the privilege of visiting several different cultures in my lifetime, and there are some things that will not fly here that are the preferred method of action there. So it does seem that right that we ought to allow for that flexibility, right, for cultures to kind of be free to make those adjustments. And then it also seems right that one society shouldn't judge another society based on their own standards, right? So, Russia shouldn't look at India and judge, you know, India's culture or the way they do things by Russian standards. It's a completely different thing. It's a completely different ballgame, right? And cultural relativism allows for those differences. And then it does seem true that the actual behavior of a society reflects the society's values better than what it says it does. This is true with humans as well, right? If you ever run across somebody that says, "This is what I stand for," but then when you watch them in real life, they don't really stand for that. They don't really, it's not that important to them as they say it is. Well, cultures are like that too. Okay. So when you look and watch what a culture does, that'll usually tell you what they value, okay, where they spend their time, where they spend their money, what they're concerned about, what they make laws about, right? That will tell you where the culture is most concerned. And so if morality depends on how you act within a culture, and if that's if by you acting in accordance with what your rest of your culture is doing around you, if that makes you a moral person, in a sense, that makes sense because you're valuing what your culture values by behaving how your culture behaves. And that seems to make sense to a certain degree. There are some cons to cultural relativism, though. Different views in right or wrong of right and wrong are not always acceptable. Okay. It's relativism, remember. Different views of right and wrong are not always acceptable. And just because they exist doesn't make them okay. Yes, I fully agree with anybody who says, well, we have a lot of different versions of right and wrong. 1,000% we do. Yes, we do. But remember the genetic fallacy. You can't get an ought from an is. Okay, just because we do have different versions, that doesn't mean that it's okay, that they're all right. Okay? And as we know from relativism, they can't all be right. They can either all be wrong or there's only one of them that are right. Okay? Also, cultural relativism can be really vague. It's kind of has the same problems as a society. Like, what exactly is a culture? When does one culture stop and a new culture begin, right? This is honestly usually where the conflict lies between like grandparents and grandchildren, as far as a generation gap, we call it, like, oh man, they don't understand that it's a generation thing, I mean, that's where it is because they're on the edge of being in a different culture, even though they're in the same location, maybe, even though, maybe even we've grown up around them. Our grandparents are in a different culture just because of the time difference. You know what I mean? So, but that's hard to define. When does that happen? And where do you draw those lines? That's hard to define. And if you're trying to figure out how to be moral, then you're trying to figure out how to, behave in accordance with your culture, right? So how should your grandparents behave? Should they behave, if they're going to be moral, should they behave in accordance with the culture that they grew up in or with the culture they're in now? So it's a decent question. And then cultures do have to share many core values. It just seems to be the case. It's kind of like that question, how different are we really? In order for us to survive as humans, like, we really do have to share a lot of core values. And that seems to be opposite of what this is saying. Okay. It seems to be saying that no, we could be wide open with those core values. You can assign value to them however you want to. But it does seem that we have to share many core values, but we do share many core values. Okay. And the individual version of normative relativism is called subjective relativism. Okay. This one says that there are no universal moral norms of right and wrong. Okay. No moral norms of right and wrong whatsoever. All persons, individual persons, decide right and wrong for themselves. Okay, so this is when we talk about relativism as a moral theory, often most people are thinking about this one or the cultural one, right? Where what is right and wrong is determined by me, okay? And when you hear comments like, well, everybody has their own version of right and wrong, or everyone has their own morality, this is usually what people are saying, okay? They're usually saying everyone decides right and wrong for themselves, okay? There's no universals that apply to everybody. Now, this does have a couple of pros, even though it's very relativistic. It does allow for the fact that well-meaning, good people can have opposite opinions. Okay, it does seem to be the case that even people that are trying really hard to be good people come up with different opinions on things, and sometimes those opinions are directly opposed to each other, and yet they're still good people, right? So they can decide for themselves which one is right or which one is wrong. That seems to be the case, and it seems to allow for that. And it also, this is the kind of the really big pull for it. These last two is that opposing views don't need to be reconciled, and unpleasant debates are avoided, right? Which is probably the biggest reason why people are relativists, is because when everybody's right and when you can determine your own view of right and wrong, then there's no arguments, right? Because, I mean, I may disagree, but I can't really argue with you because you're right according to you and I'm right according to me. So we can just kind of like, we don't even agree to disagree because we're not disagreeing. We're both agreeing to our own sense of morality, right? Our own definition of right and wrong. So in this way, we don't argue. The flip side of that is we don't ever really talk at all, right? Because we can't communicate, because you think that way and I think this way, and there's no arguing even about it because we're both right under this theory. So what are we going to argue about, right? Okay. The cons, though, this can be used to rationalize bad behavior. It really can. If somebody's determining their own version of right and wrong, it's pretty easy to determine that something really sick or twisted is the right thing to do. Okay, think a classic case is Jeffrey Dahmer. Okay, Jeffrey Dahmer, when he was in prison, wrote a very long manifesto that's very, very well written and very well reasoned about why he did what he did and had justification for what he did. And he, serial killer, right? So he has this whole line of reasoning. Okay, he had this whole line of reasoning about why he did what he did. It wasn't just, flying by the seat of his pants. He really did have a reason and a justification for why he thought not only this was okay for him to do, but this was the right thing for him to do. And under subjective relativism, this sounds extreme, but we really cannot say that he was wrong. Okay, if subjective relativism is real, that means that everybody makes their own estimation of what is right and wrong. And Jeffrey Dahmer thought that killing people and hiding them in his fridge was a right thing to do. And we can't say anything about that under this because he's going by his own code. Because of this, then, morality becomes meaningless, right? Because anything can be called moral. And if anything can be called moral, then who knows what really is moral, right? It becomes a meaningless phrase, okay? If we say that, it's kind of like my mom used to talk to me about the word awesome, right? If we say that everything is awesome, then really nothing is awesome, because everything is awesome. Awesome loses its power, right? Well, the same thing with morality. If you say that everything is moral, okay, then we don't really know what that means. So you can do everything? I mean, it loses its power. It loses its meaning. Tolerance becomes meaningless because what's there to tolerate? Everybody's right. Even if I don't have the same opinion as you, I look at you and say, you're right. And so we're not tolerating anything. Tolerance requires disagreement, as we'll talk about later, but you're not tolerating anything because you're both right. Okay, except maybe the way the person chews their gum or something. And then finally, ethical decisions don't have to be based on reason in this theory, which is scary. Okay, ethical decisions, they could, like in Jeffrey Dahmer's case, they were really terrible reasons, but at least he had reasons, right? In this case, you don't even have to have that. Okay, you could just have desires, impulses, right? Habits, okay? They don't have to be reasoned out. They don't have to be justified. It's you just make the decision on what you think is right and wrong. So there's a few of the first several theories of relativistic theories. Okay, when we come back, we will talk about conceptual relativism, and we will go from there. If you have any questions, be sure to send me an email or come by my office, and we'll discuss it.